All right, welcome everyone. Today we're taking a deep dive into Sigmund Freud's The Unconscious.
Hmm.
It's this paper from 1915 really got people talking back then.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, getting a backstage pass to your own mind.
Yeah.
But like all those thoughts and feelings, we don't even realize are there, but Freud is saying they actually have a big impact on us.
It really is fascinating. Freud made a really strong case for the unconscious, even though, well, we can't see it, can't observe it directly.
Yeah.
He pointed to, like, everyday stuff, like, slips of the tongue or those moments when your mind goes blank, memory gaps.
Right.
He even said dreams are evidence that there's a whole lot going on under the surface,
Yeah.
below our awareness.
Yeah, it's almost kind of creepy, right?
Mhm.
Like something else is like pulling the strings.
Right.
But Freud said we can't just ignore these clues.
Exactly. He said, if our actions sometimes just don't line up with what we're consciously thinking,
Right.
it kind of suggests that there's another mental system at play.
Okay.
Like, if you see someone and they're acting happy, you assume they're feeling happy.
Yeah.
Right? Inside, even though you can't, like, feel their feelings directly,
Right.
Freud said it's the same with our own minds.
Okay. So he's saying we've got to acknowledge this unconscious to really get ourselves. But hold on. Didn't Freud also say that not everything that's unconscious is, well, repressed?
Oh, absolutely. That's key. Some unconscious stuff is just latent, meaning it's like temporarily out of mind, but you can easily remember it. Like if you're studying for a test,
Yeah.
that information is tucked away somewhere, ready when you need it.
Like having a mental, like, filing cabinet or something.
Yeah.
Some stuff's on your desk. That's conscious. Some in the drawer, preconscious.
Yeah.
But you get to it all.
Yeah, that's a good way to picture it. But Freud actually went a bit deeper. He made a distinction between the unconscious, the U6 he called it,
Okay.
and the preconscious, PCs. Think of it like your mind is a theater. Okay.
Right. The unconscious is backstage, where the actors are getting ready, thoughts and impulses. Some are just waiting for their cue to go on stage. That's consciousness. And the preconscious, that's like the wings, The actors there are ready to go, but they're not in the spotlight yet.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Mm-hmm.
So the preconscious is closer to our awareness, the unconscious more hidden. But what about feelings? Can you really have feelings you're not aware of? Doesn't that kind of contradict itself?
It does seem kind of counterintuitive, right?
Yeah.
But Freud argued that while you need consciousness to fully experience a feeling, if it's repressed, that can mess with how feelings develop, leading to what he called unconscious effects.
Okay.
It's not that the feelings themselves aren't conscious. It's more like the connection to our awareness, that's broken.
Oh, so it's like a bad phone connection. The
Yeah.
feeling's there, but the message gets all garbled.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about
Can
it.
you give an example of what that'd be like in, like, real life? Sure. Like, imagine someone who has romantic feelings for another person, but they've repressed them.
Okay.
They might feel anxious, but they don't consciously connect that anxiety to, actually being attracted to that person. The feeling's there, but the source of it is hidden.
Gotcha. That makes sense. But how does repression even work? Is it like some mental muscle we use to push things down?
Well, Freud described it as a, like, dynamic process and an economic one, too.
Yeah.
He thought our mental energy, or he called libido,
Okay.
is a limited resource. When we repress something, we're basically diverting that energy away from that thought or feeling we don't want, like building a dam to hold back a flood. He called that diverting of energy anticathexis.
Wait, so trying to not think about something actually takes effort.
Mm-hmm.
That explains a lot. You probably experienced Anticathexis yourself, like when you're trying not to give into a craving.
Right.
It takes energy to hold back.
Exactly. That's your mental energy working to build and maintain that dam. But Freud also pointed out that repression, it doesn't always look the same. There are different types, each with its own characteristics.
Wow, different types of repression. Surprising.
Yeah.
Why would the unconscious express itself in so many different ways?
That's a great question. He talked about anxiety hysteria, conversion hysteria, and obsessional neurosis. Like with anxiety hysteria, those repressed impulses can kind of break through as phobias,
Right.
Like maybe someone's scared of spiders, but it's really masking some deeper unresolved issue. Then there's conversion hysteria, where the repressed energy comes out through, like, physical symptoms,
Oh, interesting.
often symbolizing the underlying problem.
So like our body's trying to tell us something through these symptoms.
And then you've got obsessional neurosis with those persistent thoughts, the ones you can't get rid of, and the compulsive behaviors. It's almost like the mind trying to control the anxiety that's coming from those repressed impulses.
So we see how repression works. But the unconscious isn't just a storage unit, right? It actually thinks differently. What did Freud say about that?
Oh, that's where things get really interesting. One of the most striking things is its timelessness. It's not bound by time in the same way conscious thoughts are.
Hold on, you're saying time works differently in the unconscious.
Right.
It's like in dreams, right? Where
Yeah.
past, present, and future can all get mixed up. Have you ever had a dream where time felt jumbled? I had one where I was a kid again, but I also knew I was an adult. So bizarre.
Exactly. That dream, it shows how time works in the unconscious. Different periods can all exist at once. And another big difference is that the unconscious, it works on what Freud called primary process thinking. Ideas are a lot more fluid. They can shift and combine in ways that wouldn't make sense to our conscious minds.
So logic doesn't really apply in the unconscious.
Right.
That's so different from how we usually think. Do you have an example that might make this a bit clearer?
Sure, think of charades, where one gesture can mean a whole concept. In the unconscious, ideas can merge and change meanings really quickly, you know?
Huh, that's a great analogy. So the unconscious is this bizarre, timeless world where logic takes a back seat. But how does this all connect to conditions like schizophrenia? Didn't Freud think schizophrenia could teach us something about the unconscious?
He did. Freud noticed that people with schizophrenia, they have a really big disruption in their thinking and language. He thought this was because the connection between words and what they mean, that connection breaks down.
So they experience a disconnect between the word itself and the thing it refers to.
Exactly. Freud suggested that in schizophrenia, what he called thing presentations in the unconscious, they get detached from their matching word presentations in the preconscious. That's what leads to those disturbances in thought and language we see.
So words kind of lose their usual meaning and become more symbolic, almost like in dreams.
Exactly.
It really makes you realize how fragile the link between language and reality can be.
It does, and it shows just how much of how we understand the world actually depends on language. But going back to Freud's overall model of the unconscious for a second.
Okay, so if we're saying this unconscious is like this swirling mess of primal urges and repressed stuff, how does it actually connect with the organized, rational part of our minds, the preconscious? It's not like they're totally separate, right?
Right, you're exactly right. Freud actually argued that communication between those two, the unconscious and preconscious, it's not just one way.
Okay.
It's not just about things getting pushed down into the unconscious. There's a constant back and forth, this exchange of energy and information.
So it's more like a two-way radio then. The unconscious isn't just sitting there passively, it's trying to get messages through.
Exactly. Freud thought the unconscious is always trying to express itself, make its presence known. It does this through what he called derivatives, things like slips of the tongue, dreams, even those neurotic symptoms we were talking about.
So those things that seem random, they're actually like coded messages from the unconscious.
Yeah.
It's trying to tell us something, but we need to figure out the code.
Exactly. And, that's a big part of what psychoanalysts do, trying to decode those messages. But here's the thing. Freud said not all derivatives are, created equal. Some are very sophisticated, almost like indistinguishable from conscious thoughts.
Wait, so some of these unconscious impulses can be sneaky, like disguising themselves to get past the censors.
Yeah, you could say that. And these disguised impulses, they can get really powerful, really influential in our conscious lives. Freud actually compared them to people of mixed race who, they might look white, but they still face discrimination because of their hidden heritage.
Wow, that's a really powerful analogy. So even if those unconscious impulses seem harmless on the surface, they still carry this mark of their unconscious origin, which can trigger those defense mechanisms.
Right. Exactly. And this is where, Anticathexis comes in again. Remember, it's how the preconscious uses mental energy to keep those unwanted thoughts and feelings away. Even these really organized derivatives, they can trigger anticathexis if they get too strong or threatening.
So it's like a constant battle then. The unconscious wanting to be heard and the preconscious trying to keep things in order. Our poor minds are a war zone.
In a way, yeah. And the outcome of this battle, that's what determines what our conscious experience is like. But let's focus on the preconscious a bit now.
Okay.
Remember, it's the part of our mind that's not in our awareness right now, but we can easily bring it to mind. Freud had some interesting things to say about how it works.
All right, so while the unconscious is busy sending out its smoke signals, what's the preconscious doing?
Right.
Is it just playing defense, or does it have its own thing going on?
Well, first of all, the preconscious, it's responsible for keeping order, coherence in our mental lives. It's what lets us think logically, make plans, understand our experiences. It works on what Freud called the secondary process, which is a more logical, reality-based way of thinking.
So if the unconscious is this, like, wild jungle, the preconscious is a well-kept garden.
Mm-hmm.
Everything organized and under control.
Yeah, that's a great image. And the preconscious, it's also where our conscious memories are. And it's really important for language, for rational thought.
But if the preconscious is all about logic and order, does it ever actually talk to the wild child of the unconscious directly?
Right.
Or is it always through those sneaky derivatives?
That's a question that fascinates Freud. He noticed that sometimes the two systems, they seem surprisingly independent. Like they're in parallel universes with very little direct communication.
Wait, so sometimes they just ignore each other. But what about those times when, like, an unconscious impulse seems to directly influence our thoughts or actions?
Yeah.
Like someone who's scared of snakes suddenly feeling anxious for, like, no reason.
Well, Freud thought that even though direct communication might be limited, sometimes the two systems can cooperate.
Okay.
This usually happens when an unconscious impulse kind of lines up with something that's already happening in the preconscious.
So it's like the unconscious impulse is hitching a ride on a preconscious bandwagon.
Exactly. And when that happens, the results can be really amazing. Think of those aha moments, those flashes of inspiration, or those subtle insights that seem to come from nowhere. That could be the unconscious and preconscious working together.
That's pretty incredible. It really makes you realize how much is happening under the surface. So much mental activity we're not even aware of. It's kind of humbling, isn't it?
It is, and this is where Freud's work gets really thought-provoking. He argued that to really understand ourselves, we have to acknowledge the power of this hidden world inside us. Our thoughts, feelings, actions, they're often shaped by forces we're not even aware of.
So we're not always totally in control of our own minds.
Mm-hmm.
That's fascinating, but also a little scary.
It is a bit unsettling.
Oh.
But it also shows how important self-awareness is. If we can learn to recognize how the unconscious influences us, even in subtle ways, we can start to make better choices,
Mm-hmm.
live more authentically.
But if this unconscious is so hard to pin down, how can we even start to understand it? It's like trying to study a ghost or something.
Well, Freud thought the key was to analyze those derivatives we were talking about.
Okay.
By paying close attention to those, slips of the tongue, the weird dreams, even those neurotic symptoms, we can start to understand the logic of the unconscious. It's like being a detective, piecing together clues.
So we're all amateur psychoanalysts then, constantly trying to understand our own lines and everyone else's.
Exactly. And that's where Freud's work gets really practical. He didn't just describe the unconscious, he developed ways to access it, to interpret it. And those techniques, they became the foundation for psychoanalysis.
I can see why that would be both really influential and controversial. I mean, it's a pretty radical idea that we could be driven by unconscious motives. But before we get into that, let's just take a minute to appreciate how big Freud's contribution was. He wasn't just talking about dreams and slips of the tongue. He was suggesting a whole new way of understanding the human mind.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Freud's work was truly groundbreaking. He challenged this idea that the mind is just rational and conscious. He showed that there's this huge hidden dimension full of those primal urges, repressed desires, and forgotten memories. And he argued that this hidden dimension, it plays a big role in shaping our thoughts, our feelings, our actions.
Yeah, it's a powerful idea that's had a massive impact on how we understand ourselves and the world. And it's not just psychology, right? Freud's ideas have influenced everything from art and literature to philosophy, even how we talk every day. Think about how often we use terms like ego, repression, Freudian slip. They're just part of our culture now.
That's true. It really shows how powerful Freud's ideas were. He gave us a whole new way to talk about the mind, and that language has become, part of who we are. And even though some of his specific theories have been challenged or updated, that basic insight, that the unconscious is a huge part of human experience, it's still incredibly influential. He opened up this whole new frontier in how we understand ourselves, and we're still exploring that frontier today.
So what does this all mean for us us regular people out here trying to understand our own minds, how can we actually use these insights in our lives?
I think one of the most valuable takeaways is that, we're not always totally honest with ourselves. Our conscious minds, it's just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much going on beneath the surface, stuff we might not even be aware of.
So little humility is in order.
Mm-hmm.
We need to admit that there might be hidden motives, hidden influences shaping our thoughts and actions.
Exactly. And this awareness, it can be both freeing and challenging. It can help us understand why we sometimes act in ways that, seem irrational or self-sabotaging. It can also help us be more compassionate with ourselves and others because, we're all complex. We all have these hidden depths.
So instead of trying to repress or deny those unconscious impulses, maybe we should try to understand them, bring them to the open, make them part of who we are.
Yeah. That's basically what psychoanalysis is all about, making the unconscious conscious. But even if we don't go through analysis, we can still learn from Freud. By paying attention to our dreams, slips of the tongue, how we react emotionally, we can start to understand ourselves better, understand the forces shaping our lives.
That's a really empowering message. I mean, self-knowledge is this ongoing journey, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it takes curiosity about our own minds and a willingness to explore those hidden depths.
Yeah, and that exploration can be really rewarding. It can help us live more authentically, make better choices, even have more fulfilling relationships.
Sounds like it's worth the effort.
Yeah.
So we're all amateur psychoanalysts trying to make sense of ourselves and those around us.
Absolutely. And the more we learn about the unconscious, the more we realize how much there still is to learn. Freud opened up this whole new world of possibilities for understanding the human mind, and we're still uncovering those possibilities in exciting and unexpected ways.
Okay, so if there's one thing you want listeners to take away from this deep dive into the unconscious, what would it be? What's the most important thing they should remember?
That's a tough one. But if I had to pick, I'd say it's that the unconscious isn't just some weird concept that only matters to people in therapy. It's a fundamental part of being human, and it affects all of our lives in really significant ways.
So we're all living in a Freudian world, whether we know it or not.
I think that's a fair statement. And understanding this hidden world inside us, it has so much potential for creativity, for growth, and ultimately for living more fulfilling lives.
It's a challenge, but it's also an exciting opportunity.
Now, before we wrap up this part, let's talk about how the unconscious actually develops. Where does this hidden world come from in the first place?
Okay, so Freud said that the core of the unconscious, it's formed from what he called instinctual representatives. Those are like the primal urges that are looking for a way out. Think of them as the foundation that our mental structure is built on. He thought these instinctual impulses are there from birth, and they work on what he called the pleasure principle, always trying to get immediate gratification.
Hold on. What exactly is the pleasure principle? It sounds interesting, but can you explain it a little more? Sure. It's basically the idea that we're wired to seek pleasure and avoid pain. Think of a baby. Their whole world is about getting their needs met right away. Food, comfort, stimulation. Freud believed this drive for pleasure, it's a fundamental force in our lives, even as we grow up.
Okay, so we're born with this primal soup of urges and desires always bubbling away, driven by the pleasure principle. But as we get older, we learn that we can't always get what we want right.
Right.
How does that fit into how the unconscious develops?
That's a good question. So as we develop, those primal urges get shaped by our experiences, by how we interact with the world and what society demands of us. We learn that some impulses and desires are okay while others aren't.
So it's like society comes along with a rule book and starts telling us what we can and can't do, what we can and can't want.
Exactly. And Freud argued that when we're kids, certain impulses and desires that are seen as unacceptable or that don't fit with social norms, those get repressed, pushed down into the unconscious.
Interesting. So we start with this wild mess of impulses, and then society comes along and starts pruning the branches that don't fit in.
Yeah.
But what happens to those pruned branches? They don't just vanish, do they?
You're right, they don't. Those repressed impulses and desires, they're still there in the unconscious. And they can be really powerful even though they're hidden. They can influence our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors.
That's both fascinating and a little creepy. So we're all carrying around this hidden garden of repressed desires shaped by our childhood and what society tells us. But when does this unconscious really solidify? When does that line between the unconscious and the preconscious become more clear?
Freud believed that it usually doesn't happen until puberty.
Puberty? Why puberty?
He saw adolescence as this really crucial time for how the unconscious develops. There's all this sexual energy plus the challenges of figuring out social relationships, and this often leads to more repression. And people develop more complex defense mechanisms. It's like puberty just throws a ton of fuel on the fire, and the preconscious has to work even harder to keep things under control.
So all those crazy hormones and confusing emotions of being a teenager, they're actually helping to shape the unconscious. I wish I'd known that when I was going through puberty. It made me feel a lot less crazy back then.
It's true. Adolescence is often really emotionally intense, and Freud saw this as a direct result of that back and forth between the unconscious and the preconscious.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's kind of comforting to know that those feelings of being overwhelmed, confused, they're actually normal. It's not like we're, falling apart.
Exactly. And it shows just how important it is to understand the unconscious. The more we know about this hidden part of our minds, the better we can deal with those challenges, both as teenagers and throughout our lives.
So, to wrap things up for this part, what's the key takeaway for our listeners? What's the big aha moment we want them to leave with?
Yeah, I think the big takeaway is that puberty, it's not just about physical changes.
Right.
It's also a really important time for our unconscious minds to develop. Like our inner world is going through its own puberty, I guess.
That's a great way to think about it.
Right.
And it can be really helpful for anyone who, works with teens or even just anyone trying to understand their own teenage years. It's a reminder that all those big emotions, the confusing behaviors, they often come from something deeper, something going on beneath the surface.
Yeah, it's almost like we get a second chance to understand our teenage selves, now that we know about the unconscious. But let's shift gears a bit. We've been talking about how society shapes the unconscious, but how much of this is already decided from the start? Did Freud think we're born with a blank slate, or did he believe that some parts of the unconscious are just innate? That's a great question. It gets right to the heart of that whole nature versus nurture debate. And while Freud knew that outside factors played a role, he also thought that certain basic instincts and drives, those are there from birth. He called these the id impulses. Remember those raw, unfiltered desires for pleasure and gratification we talked about?
Yeah.
That's what we're talking about here.
Okay, so the id is like the ultimate party animal of the mind. Always wants what it wants when it wants it. Doesn't care about rules or consequences.
Exactly. And these id impulses, they're a big part of what makes up the unconscious. But as we grow up, another part of our personality starts to emerge, what Freud called the ego. The ego is like the mediator, the one who negotiates between what the id wants and the realities of the world.
So the ego is the responsible older sibling who has to keep the id in check, trying to figure out how to satisfy those desires without getting everyone into trouble.
Exactly. The ego develops as we learn to, wait for what we want, to think about consequences, to adapt to the rules of society. It's the part of us that tries to find realistic ways to get our needs met, ways that are okay with society.
So it sounds like the ego has a pretty tough job.
Right.
Stuck between the id's demands and the constraints of reality. No wonder we feel so conflicted sometimes.
Exactly. And Freud thought this inner conflict, it's a key part of being human. He thought the way the id, ego, and another part of the personality, the superego, all interact. That's what shapes everything, our thoughts, feelings, actions. The superego, it's the one that internalizes moral values, the norms of society.
Hold on, another part. The superego. Okay, I'm going to need you to break that down for me. What exactly does the superego do in this mental tug of war?
Think of the superego as your inner moral compass. It's the voice of your conscience telling you what's right and wrong, what you should and shouldn't do. It develops through your relationships with your parents, authority figures, society in general.
So the superego is like the voice of our parents, teachers, all the rule makers stuck inside our heads.
Exactly. And the superego, it can be really demanding, often setting standards for us that are impossible to meet. It's where those feelings of guilt come from. Shame, feeling like we're not good enough. We all experience that sometimes.
So we've got the id pushing for pleasure, the ego trying to find a balance, and the superego laying down the law. It sounds like our minds are just a constant battlefield.
You could say that, but Freud thought this tension, it's actually what drives us to grow psychologically. It's through this constant negotiation between these different parts of ourselves that we figure out how to deal with the world, how to become who we are.
So understanding these different parts, the id, ego, superego, it can help us make sense of those conflicts we feel inside.
Absolutely. It's like having a map of your inner world. It helps you understand what's shaping your thoughts, feelings, actions.
Wow. This has been an incredible deep dive into the unconscious. We've explored all these hidden depths of the mind, uncovered the secrets of repression, and learned about this dynamic relationship between the id, ego, and superego. What a journey.
It's been a pleasure to explore these ideas with you.
And to everyone listening, we hope this deep dive has, shed some light on the mysteries of the unconscious mind. And maybe now you look at those little clues, the slips of the tongue, the dreams, in a different way. You might even find yourself unraveling your own unconscious mysteries.
Remember, the unconscious isn't something to be afraid of. It's a source of wisdom, of insight. It's waiting to be explored.
That's a great point. Thanks for joining us, everyone, and keep exploring those hidden depths.